So we learned how to construct and how to consume promises, but the syntax to consume promises can still be quite confusing and difficult to manage. And so in ES8 or ES 2017, something called AsyncAwait was introduced to the JavaScript language in order to make it a lot easier for us developers to consume promises. So let's now take a look at AsyncAwait. So again, AsyncAwait was designed for us to consume promises and not to produce them. So if we want to produce promises, we just do it the way that we learned in the last lecture. But most of the time, we're going to consume promises anyway, and AsyncAwait makes that a lot easier to do. So without further ado, let's see how to use it in practice. And what we're going to do is basically to change the way we consume them in the last lecture, so this piece of code, and instead use AsyncAwait. So these promises that we have here, these three, we will continue using them. We will simply get rid of this code here for now and do the same thing with AsyncAwait. Okay? And so we start by creating an async function. So use the async keyword, then function, and let's say get recipes, and then I'm going to call it AW for AsyncAwait. Okay, and then we can also just call it down here. All right. So this is a new special kind of function, which simply means that this function is an asynchronous function. So one that basically keeps running in the background just the way that we've learned before. This async function then returns a promise, but more on that a bit later. For now, what's important is that inside an async function, we can have one or more await expressions. So in order to consume our first promise, we can do it like this. We simply say const IDs await get IDs. So this get IDs here is our first promise, right? So get IDs is this promise here. And then to consume it, we simply say await IDs and assign the result to this IDs variable. And what happens here is that this await expression here will really stop the code from executing at this point until the promise is fulfilled. So in this case, this get IDs promise. And if the promise is resolved, which remember means that it was successful, then the value of the await expression is the resolved value of the promise, which is then assigned to this IDs variable. Okay, so again, in this case, our promise will resolve to this value here, so this array, and so this IDs here will then become the value of that resolved value, so that array that I just showed you. Okay, and to demonstrate this to you, let me then just simply log this to the console. So IDs. Run it, and let's see it, and here we go. So after 1.5 seconds, we log the resolved value of the get IDs promise. Okay, and so again, what happens here is that we fire off the function, so we start the function, and it then keeps running asynchronously in the background. And then here, we wait for this promise here to resolve, assign the value to this IDs variable, and then simply log it to the console. Now, if the promise is rejected, then an error will be thrown. And if you want to handle that error, we have to include some more code here, but that's not really important for now at this point. And so I'm leaving that for the next lecture. Okay, so let's now consume our other two promises. So this one I'm going to call a recipe, and we will await the result of our next promise. And that one we get simply by calling get recipe, just like this here, right? So we have our get recipe function, right? Which is this one here, which will then return a promise. And so we await that that promise finishes. And after it finishes, we can then log the recipe to the console. And now the next one, let's simply call it a related and await the next one. So we can actually use, again, this code here. And that's it. So let's check it out here. And this should work the exact same way as before. And yeah, here we go. So here we have our result, just like we had when we consumed the promise in this way here. Okay, and I think that this way here is really a lot easier. So all we do is to simply await until each of these promises here gets resolved. And in each of these lines where we use the await keyword, the execution stops and we wait until a promise returns. So that's how AsyncAwait works. It allows us to consume promises, but without all the callbacks that we have with the callback hell, and to some degree also in promises with the then and the catch methods. Now I just want to make it very clear again that the await expression can only be used inside an async function, okay? And this async function, remember, it runs in the background. And that's very important because we can never have the main code stopping. And so all we do here is to block the code in the async function, which runs in the background anyway, okay? And so again, stopping the function here is not a problem because it just runs in the background anyway, okay? So in here, in this line of code, we synchronously call this getRecipes function, which then does all this stuff here just in the background, okay? Now, this is all really great already. Now, just imagine that we actually wanted to return a value here from this async function. So let's try something which is not going to work, but I'm going to show you anyway. So let's say that we want to return the recipe. So we can assign then this return value here to this result, right? And then we can log it to the console. Now this is not really going to work, right? So let me show it to you. So all this logs here is this promise, and it says pending here. And so that's not really the result that we were looking for. We were hoping that it would log to the console the result of the recipe. So basically this here, right? And so why didn't this work? Well, it doesn't work because this function here runs asynchronously in the background. And so by the time that we try to run this console.log here, this getRecipe function is still running in the background. And so all that is logged is this promise here, which simply says, well, this rec here, it is a promise, but we don't have any result yet, and so we cannot log anything to the console, right? Because remember that this code here is of course run synchronously, right? And so it runs this here, then it puts it off to the background, and then immediately it will run this next line. But by the time we run it, this getRecipes function here will still be doing its job and will then log this data here long after this line here has already run, okay? So how could we actually solve this problem? Well, remember how I told you a bit earlier that an async function always automatically returns a promise. And so if we return a value from the async function using the return keyword, so just like I did here, then the promise will automatically be resolved with this returned value, okay? Now this may sound a bit confusing, but it's very straightforward. So let me just show it to you. So this one here doesn't really work, but what we can do here is to then simply use the then method, just like we did before. Because again, this function here automatically returns a promise with the resolved value of recipe. And so we can now use this then, into which we pass a callback function where the argument is the resolved value of the promise. So let's just say a recipe here, or result, it doesn't really matter, let's just call it result, okay, why not? And then we can simply console.log this result to the console. And we can maybe add some more text so that it's different from this one here. So let's use the backticks here. Then we of course need these curly braces. Is the best ever. So something like this. And so now let's test it again. And wait for it. And here we go. So fresh tomato pasta is the best ever. And so now it works just the way we wanted it to work, right? And so what we did here is to use then, which is basically to consume this promise, just like I showed you before up here, right? Which is possible simply because of the fact that this async function here always returns a promise that we can then consume. Okay, and we will actually need to use this trick here later in the big project that we're going to code. And so it's important that you familiarize yourself with this piece of code and that you really understand and that it makes sense to you at this point. Okay, so I hope you saw that AsyncAwait makes it so much easier to work with promises. And that's just because of the fact that it looks like the normal synchronous code that we're already used to. It just works in an asynchronous way behind the scenes. Okay, so again, this really looks like synchronous JavaScript code that we've been written all the time. We just need to understand that behind the scenes, because of this async and await, this is asynchronous code. But as long as we understand how and why all of this works, we can now use this fantastic new tool to our advantage.